Good morning. It is good to be with you this morning. I'm glad that you're here. If you're visiting with us, we want to invite you to stick around afterwards and let us shake your hand and meet you face to face. Welcome to Spring Creek. This is a place where you'll meet Jesus. Continue to pray for Keith and his family and the group that is in South Africa. They'll return next week and should be back with us next week. And so I want to make sure that we continue to pray for them. We are talking this morning again about rooted and what it means to be rooted. We are going to open our Bibles up to John chapter 8 and talk about a statement that Jesus makes when he says, I am the light of the world. Jesus, at this point in time, is talking with a group of folks, the Pharisees. You'll know them maybe not. The Pharisees are a group of religious rulers at the time of Jesus. And the Pharisees believe that they have got everything just sort of right, okay? They are a people who, I believe, sincerely seek God. They are people who want to know what it is that God desires of them and want to follow the rules in this place. The problem is that the Pharisees have placed more importance in the ability to follow rules than on the movement of God in their lives. Rather than continuously seeking what it is that God desires, the Pharisees lead a life with God that's based on how good can I do things? How much can I accomplish on my own? How much can I accomplish in my own strength? Okay? Jesus steps in the middle of this group of Pharisees, it seems like, over and over and over again in his life, and he's always in conflict with the Pharisees. The Pharisees look at Jesus and say, you don't do what we do. You don't do it like we're doing it. You don't do it like we have said needs to be done. And the Pharisees have the wrong standard. Jesus stands in their life and says, the question is, how does God want it done? The question is, what does God say about this? The question is, what is it that God is looking for? And Jesus spends a lot of time with the Pharisees trying to get them to see who God is and trying to get them to see what it is that God desires and trying to get them to see what it is that God wants in their lives. But the Pharisees just sort of refuse to believe, okay? The Pharisees are a people who live in darkness. And so in John chapter 8, verse 12, we have Jesus still in the midst of this whole sort of a conversation, and Jesus makes this statement. When Jesus spoke again to the people, he said, I am the light of the world. Whoever follows me will never walk in darkness, but will have the light of life. The Pharisees challenged him. Here you are appearing as your own witness. Your testimony is not valid. And they get back into that argument. And they get back into that fight. Jesus, you're not saying the right things. You come and you say this is, and Jesus will say, what is it that God has to say? What is it that God witnesses to? What is it that God testifies about? And so we have this wrangling back and forth between Jesus and the Pharisees, right? The Pharisees are one of those people that I think we need to look at because the Pharisees are a group that is walking in darkness. It's interesting to me, Jesus makes these statements, these I am statements, where he says, I want you to see my character, I want you to see my nature, I want you to see who I am. They're always followed, or they're always in the middle of some sort of a context that gives that saying meaning, okay? Turn over one chapter to John chapter 9, and take a look at the story that's found in John chapter 9. In John chapter 9, starting in verse 1, it says, As he went along, he saw a man blind from birth. His disciples asked him, Rabbi, who sinned, this man or his parents, that he was born blind? In John chapter 9, Jesus and the disciples are walking along, and they see a man, and the man is born blind, right? What does that mean? That means he walks in darkness, right? He walks in darkness. The blind man is going to be a picture of the Pharisees. The blind man lives in a place where he cannot see, but so do the Pharisees, don't they? They live in a place where they will not see. They live in a place where they're not looking for what it is that God is doing in their life. They're living in a place where they're not looking at what it is that God wants in their life, while they still desire to have a relationship with God. They just want to do it in their own strength. They want to do it in their own power. As we begin to talk about light this morning, it is important for us to understand that we live in a world that darkness is present. Okay? Now, that's not always fun to have to admit, is it? But we live in a world where darkness is present. We live in a world where people are walking around blind. where they cannot see what is true or what is right, where they want purpose and they want direction, but they don't know how to find it, where they want something more, and yet they can't look past themselves to get that. We live in a world where we think that self-confidence, that self-ability, that self-righteousness, that self-empowerment is the way to travel in the world, and that's just not true. Those places are places that are darkness. Those places are places that say, I rely on myself, and if I can't see outside of myself, and if I can't see beyond my own strength, and if I can't see God at work, then I live in darkness. One of the hard things to understand about darkness is that good people, people that we like, people that we are neighbors with, people that we respect, sometimes walk in darkness. Sometimes are consumed by darkness. Okay? Jesus and the disciples are walking along and they see a guy who is blind, who's been born blind. And the disciples look at this man and they say, Jesus, here's an interesting fella. Here's a guy that was born blind. Isn't that sort of a shame? Isn't that sort of a terrible thing? You know, he may be a nice guy. He may be one of these guys, but he was born blind. What do you think it was? Do you think it was him who sinned, or do you think it was his parents? I mean, can you see the disciples sitting there doing that? Well, you know, if it was his parents, what do you think they might have done? What do you think it might have been? Well, you know, but what if it's him and he was born blind and God knew he was going to... And there's a lot of talk about what this guy is doing, a lot of talk about what this guy is experiencing, a lot of talk about how bad it is that this fella is blind because of sin, right? Now, there's a truth there for us. Sin causes darkness. Sin affects our sight. Sin causes us to lose sight of what is important, doesn't it? And we need to understand that. The disciples talk about this guy as if he were sort of an interesting case study, don't they? Now get the picture in total. We've got these guys that have been walking with Jesus, and what has Jesus been doing? Jesus has been talking about God. Jesus has been healing lame men. Jesus has been causing the blind eyes to see. Jesus has been raising the dead. Jesus has been doing miraculous things, and yet the disciples look around at this blind man and talk about him as if there were no cure for what it is that's going on in his life. They look at him and say, we have questions about him, and we might want to feel sorry for him, but we're not in a place where we're going to offer him something, are we? Jesus, who do you think it was? Him or his parents that caused him to be blind? Isn't that a shame that there's a world that walks in darkness? Isn't it a shame that there are folks who exist in the world who are good folks, but they don't know what truth is? Isn't it a shame that there are people who walk around without purpose, without knowing, without knowledge in the world, and we should shake our heads and feel sorry for them, right? Jesus looks at the disciples and says, it is not him, and it is not his parents. It is an opportunity. It is an opportunity to bring light where light is necessary. It is an opportunity to show what God can do. It is an opportunity to show how it is that God is on the move. It is an opportunity to show how it is that God is at work in the lives of people. And then Jesus pulls this blind guy aside, makes a little mud, puts it on his eyes, and tells him to go and wash. And you know what happens? He opens those eyes up and he can see. How different is his world? How different is his experience? How different is it because he has come into contact with Jesus? As Jesus stands in John chapter 8 and tells the Pharisees, I am the light of the world, what he tells them is, I can do something in this place that is neat. I can do something in this place that will change the way that you see. I can make everything that you want about God and about purpose and about power come true. If you will look beyond yourself, if you will look beyond the promises of the world, if you'll look beyond what it is that you've been looking at and anchor yourself in me. Part of being rooted means that we're to be anchored, doesn't it? See, when Jesus stands up and proclaims, I am light, he is telling them that I have come to illuminate what is needed in the lives of men. If you were to go back in time just a little bit into John chapter 1, As John opens up the gospel here, he writes these words starting in verse 9. He says, "The true light that gives light to every man was coming into the world. He was in the world, and though the world was made through him, the world did not recognize him. He came to that which was his own, but his own did not receive him." Jesus came into the world as light to illuminate what it is that men needed, and what did men do? His own rejected him. His own people. That's what the Pharisees are. They're the people of God. They're Jews. They're folks who want a relationship with God, and yet they stand in the world and they say, "Jesus, we don't want what it is that you have to give." In John chapter 8, Jesus says, light is about showing you what it is that you need. Light is about showing you what it is that is true. Light is about showing you what it is that will change who you are. Light is about allowing you to see God at work. We live in a world of darkness where people are lost in darkness. And we can look at them and shake our heads and go, "Oh, poor them." Or we can look and say, there is a truth, and there is a person, and there is a God who can change your circumstance. What does every person who lives in darkness need? What does every person who lives in darkness need? The same thing that the blind man needed, right? The same thing that the Pharisees have been rejecting. Every person who lives in darkness, every person who experiences darkness, every person who lives in a world where there is darkness present needs Jesus. Amen? That means that the world that we live in needs Jesus. But Jesus has hidden himself, right? Jesus is elusive. Jesus sort of stands in the background and says, "I don't know about that," right? So we can be like the disciples and walk around and say, what do you think about all this stuff that's going on? What do you think about this stuff that happens in our world? What do you think about the state of Tomball or state of the United States? Well, what do you think about this or that or the other? Oh, look at that family, they're having trouble. Isn't that too bad? We can feel sorry for them. We can feel bad about that. We can talk about what got them there. We can pinpoint the source of their trouble. We can understand they walk in darkness, but I just feel sorry for them. Or we can share with them an answer. What is the answer to their family trouble? Jesus. What is the answer to financial trouble? Jesus. Bill's on his list again. That's right. What is the answer to relationship troubles? Jesus. Jesus came into the world to illuminate what it is that we need, to show us what it is that will help us to walk through the problems in the world. Jesus comes to say, "I am the light of the world," right? That blind man had no chance without Jesus. We have no chance without Jesus. The world we live in has no chance without Jesus. Yeah, but Bill, we talk about darkness as if that means somebody's off in there, this evil, vile. No. Darkness affects good people. There are people that you know and people that you love and people that you respect who experience trouble in the world because they walk without Jesus. Because they walk in darkness. They're not bad in the sense that the only thing that they look for is evil, but they don't know what they need. Trying to do it in their own strength. Trying to accomplish it by their own might. Just like the Pharisees, right? Jesus says, "I am the light of the world." We have people that walk around that are directionless. And light is about giving direction. And when we anchor ourselves in Jesus, we understand what we need, but we also understand what our purpose is and what our direction is and where it is that we're supposed to walk. In Psalm 119, the psalmist writes, "Your word is a lamp to my feet and a light to my path." See, when Jesus came into the world, he came in the world to give directions, to give guidance, to lay out a path that we can walk, to invite us into a relationship where we get to walk with Jesus in that place. And Jesus says, I want that to be foundational to what your lifestyle is. I want that to be foundational to what it is that you do. We cannot walk in the world in the light unless we walk in the world with Jesus. Unless we walk beside him, unless we follow in his footsteps, unless we cling closely to him. unless his name is on our hearts and on our lips and in our hands. When Jesus came and said, I am the light of the world, what he was saying is, if you want to know how to come into contact with God, if you want to know how to live in a state where you understand the direction you're supposed to walk, then you have to walk with Jesus. There is no other way. We're going to talk about that in just a couple of weeks. But there is no other way. Jesus says, if you want to know where to go in this world, then go with me. Right? See, light illuminates and light gives direction. In 1 John 1:7, John writes, if we walk in the light as he is in the light, we have fellowship with one another, and the blood of his Son, Jesus, cleanses us from all sin. It is in that relationship where Jesus offers not just to walk alongside of us, and not just to walk in, but to walk with us in intimacy, to walk with us in fellowship, to put his arms around us and walk together. And there's a picture there that you need to see. There's a picture there that you want to lay hold of, because what Jesus does is he comes and he says, when I tell you that I am the light of the world, there is purpose to that. What can we anchor ourselves in when we talk about light of the world? We can anchor ourselves in the fact that Jesus came to tell us what it is that we need. Jesus came to walk with us through that need, and that Jesus came to change what it is that we are so that we don't have that need. Now, Jesus comes to fulfill all needs, doesn't he? What we anchor ourselves in is that there's nothing that Jesus can't do. There's no place that Jesus won't walk. There's nothing that Jesus cannot change in our lives, because he is the light of the world. We know about light, don't we? We like light, don't we? I do. I get up in the middle of the night, and what's the first thing I want to do? Turn on a light. What is pray? Turn on a light, right? But I think, I don't need a light, because if I turn on the light, then my eyes get all hurt. I don't want to do that. You got to adjust. You got to sit here, and I just got to get up for just a second, right? I'm going to get up and go peek on Walker, and I'm going to come back to bed. So I don't need a light. So I swing my legs out of the bed and step on the floor and find the Lego that Walker left there last night, right? Trip over the Lego, take 2 steps, and kick the dog. You know, the dog gets up and runs out, and I get out, stumble to the... By this time, I got everybody in the house up, right? What does a little light do? A little light shows me where the trouble's at, doesn't it? A little light lets me walk with and around obstacles. A little light lets me see clearly. Jesus comes and says, I am the light of the world. Not a little light, but a big light. A light that can illuminate everything that you need to see. And so take a moment to turn on the light. Take a moment to spend some time with Jesus. Take a moment to see what it is that God is doing in your life and how it is that he's calling you to walk with him. Turn over to Matthew chapter 5. In Matthew chapter 5, Jesus does something amazing, which is inherent in all of the I am statements in John. Jesus invites us to come in and absorb who he is, okay? He invites us to come in and to soak up his nature and to soak up his character and to soak up who he is. But in this particular instance, when Jesus says, I am the light of the world, he does something very unique, okay, in this place. Because what we do is when Jesus says, I am the light of the world, and he says that a couple of times. He says it in John 8:12, and he says it in 9:25, and he says it where he says, I am the light of the world, I am the light of the world, I am the light of the world. It's one of those statements that we are familiar with. It's one of those statements that we know about. Because Jesus says he invites us in to experience his life, says, what I want to do is I want to make a change or a transformation in you. When you take time to turn on the light, when you take time to see where it is that God wants you to go, when you take time to walk with God in the light the way that he invites us to, God makes a change in who we are. All right? God makes a change in what we are. God makes a change in what our nature and our character is, because in Matthew chapter 5 and verse 14, Jesus says this, you are the light of the world. And we look at that and go, hey, that's cool. Jesus in John says, I am the light of the world, but in Matthew he says, you are the light of the world. What does that mean? That means when we walk with Jesus, we become like Jesus. when we absorb what it is that Jesus has to offer, when we stand in the light and we soak up that assurance, when we soak up that direction, when we take on what it is that Jesus is giving us, then Jesus transforms who we are. Why? Because Jesus wants us to make an impact in the world around us, doesn't he? I mean, read the passage there in verse 14. You are the light of the world. A city on a hill cannot be hidden. I mean, it doesn't come nighttime and they don't throw a sheet over the city, right? If there's a single light in the city on a hill, what happens? People know where the city is. People can see what's going on. See, a city set on a hill cannot be hidden. If there is light in this place, people are going to notice. People are going to see. Neither, verse 15, do people light a lamp and put it under a bowl. Instead, they put it on a stand and it gives light to everyone in the house. People don't light a lamp in order to cover it up, right? How many times have you been a kid or seen a kid that stands at the refrigerator and goes, what are they trying to do? Trying to see if the light goes off or if it stays on. Now, what's the answer to that? You don't know? You stand in the refrigerator and do no. What did you say? It goes off, right? Because who would light the inside of a refrigerator if there's nobody there to look? That's just insane, isn't it? That doesn't make any sense. That's what Jesus says. Nobody lights a lamp in order to shine it on the inside of a bowl where nobody sees. Light is meant to show folks something. Light is meant to say, I want you to look at this and I want you to see this. Light is meant to say, there is something here worth seeing. See, you don't light a lamp and put it under a bowl. You light a lamp and you put it where? Up on a stand. Up where it shines light in the whole house. Up where you can see everything. Where you can see the Legos and the dog and the doorway and the, right? Up where you can see what's going on. He says, that's why you light a lamp. Verse 16, in the same way, let your light shine before men, that they may see your good deeds and praise your Father in heaven. Therefore, let your light shine in such a way that folks can see it. You were meant to be light. You were meant to illuminate something in the darkness. Well, what am I meant to illuminate? Well, if when we stand or when we're anchored in the person of Jesus, we absorb the nature and the character of Jesus and we absorb his direction and his purpose, then what is it that we have to share? We have Jesus to share. We have Jesus to shine with. See, we don't shine with our own light. That was the problem of the Pharisees, wasn't it? They wanted to create their own light and to shine in their own way. We don't shine with our own light. We stand in this place and go, let me tell you about, let me point you to, let me show you who Jesus is and what Jesus does. We live in a world where there is darkness. We live in a world that needs some light. And Jesus looks at us and says, you are the light of the world. In John chapter 9, there's a blind man who meets Jesus. He walks in darkness, and yet when he comes into contact with Jesus, he is changed to see. Now, the people around him don't understand it. The people around him have all kinds of questions. If we go down here to verse 8, it says, his neighbors, those who had formerly seen him begging, asked, is this the same man who used to sit and beg? Some claimed that he was. Others said, no, he only looks like him. But he himself insisted, I am that man who begged. And the neighbors didn't know what to do with him. The neighbors looked at him and said, how did you get that light? How did you get to be able to see? How do you know where you're going? What is it that's going on there? In verse 13, they brought him to the Pharisees, the man who had been blind. And on that day which Jesus had made the mud and opened the man's eyes was the Sabbath. And so the Pharisees wanted to argue about whether he got the right thing or not. And the Pharisees wanted to talk about it. And the Pharisees wanted to say, could Jesus do this or not? They wanted to understand, they couldn't understand why he was walking with sight, why he was walking in the light. And so they made accusations, and they questioned him, and they questioned his parents, and they bring him back again, and they say, it couldn't have been Jesus, it couldn't have been Jesus, it couldn't have been Jesus, sinner, he couldn't have been Jesus. And in verse 25, this is what the guy has to say. He replied, whether he's a sinner or not, I don't know. One thing I do know, I was blind, but now I see. What is the difference between being blind and seeing? The difference is the presence of Jesus. We walk in a world that experiences darkness. What do they need? Jesus. They need a little light. Jesus is the light of the world. That's what they need. But you are the light of the world too. And so where are they going to hear that message from? Where are they going to understand how to alleviate the darkness? Well, the question goes to us. What's the answer to our darkness? Jesus. What's the answer to our troubles? Jesus. Do I have a story to share with folks that walk in darkness? Yeah, I do. The story is this. I walked in darkness. I was blind. I couldn't do it on my own. But here's the good news. Now I see. Right? And so I have a story to share. It's not the story of how good Bill is. It's not the story of how Bill overcame whatever personal struggle. It's not the story of how Bill did. It is the story of how Jesus changes lives. And it is the story about how Jesus illuminates the darkness. It is a story about how Jesus shows us what we need. It is a story about how Jesus gives us direction as we overcome that. It is a story about how Jesus walks along with us through the process and through that time. You have a neighbor or a coworker or a friend or a family member who needs to hear the story of Jesus. And you are the light of the world. So we come to the discipleship challenge. Here's what we're going to do this week. You ready? We're going to read John chapter 9, verse 25. What does it say? I was blind, but now I... How hard a story is that? Is that a difficult story to tell? It doesn't seem like it on the face of it, does it? I was blind, now I see. That's just the truth. That's the story of the blind man in John chapter 9. It is a very simple story about transformation. I want you to let the healed man's words help you tell the story about how Jesus changed you. Can you do that? Can you say, how did Jesus change me? I once was... Oh, did you hear that? I once was blind, I was blind. And then there's a whole group of people that say, I once was lost. I once was outside. But now I'm... Oh, you don't know where to go now, do you? Do I see or was I found? Does it matter? I once was a liar, but now I can tell the truth. I once was guilty, but now I'm forgiven. I once was like that, but now I'm like Jesus. Your story can be told in a very simple, very heartfelt, very meaningful way. I'm not going to tell you that it's easy. I'm going to tell you that it's necessary. Jesus came to shine a light in the world, and he leaves that light with us as he changes us. So the discipleship challenge is to share your story with one person this week. I want you to think about it. I want you to share your story with one person this week. I want you to share the story of what it is that Jesus has done to change your life. I don't want you to share a novel. Okay? I'm not asking you to go to your neighbor and say, I need 4 hours of your time while I walk through the years 1947 to 1973. Okay? I am asking you to choose one person that you know, that you have prayed about, that you love, to look at them and say, here's what I want you to know. I once was blind. But then I met Jesus, and now I see. And this is the way that works. And I want you to know Jesus too. Are you ready? Who will share their story with one other person this week? Say me. That's enough. if we will share our story a little bit at a time in a way that is sincere, then we bring light into the world. We make an impact because we allow Jesus to touch hearts, and we invite people to be touched by Jesus. If you've committed to doing that, I'm praying for you this week. Praying that we will share our story in such a huge way that Tomball will look at what it is that Spring Creek is doing, but that they won't see us, that they will see God on the move in Tomball. Because that's what Jesus talks about in Matthew chapter 5, isn't it? That they will see your good deeds and do what? Glorify God who is in heaven. Thank you for your commitment. Jesus changes lives. And so we come to the invitation. Jesus changes lives. Do you have a life that needs to be changed? Do you have a lifestyle that needs to be put to death in the waters of baptism? Do you have a life that needs to be repented of? Do you have a life that needs to be changed? If so, Jesus stands in this place and he invites you to come. And he says, if you need a life that needs to be changed, come right now as we stand and as we sing.